Sometimes when your heart is broken and you've lost everything that matters, the smallest act of kindness can change your entire life. Sometimes what everyone else sees as worthless is exactly what your soul needs to heal. Jedediah Boone was a broken man after losing his son to war. The folks in Dry Creek thought he'd lost his mind when he traded his winter supplies for a lame horse. Everyone called it the worst deal in town history. But this old mountain man saw something different in that beaten-down mare. He gave her a name, Clementine, and showed her the first kindness she'd known. What happened next surprised everyone in town. Would this simple act of compassion lead to riches beyond his wildest dreams? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind carried the scent of wood smoke and regret through the narrow streets of Dry Creek, Montana Territory, as Jedediah Boone pulled his worn leather gloves tighter against the chill. At 52, his hands bore the calluses of 30 years, wrestling a living from these unforgiving mountains. But lately, those same hands trembled when he thought no one was watching. The tremor wasn't from age or cold. It was from the hollow ache that had settled in his chest 3 years ago and never left. Jed's cabin sat at the edge of town, where the timberline met the valley floor. A modest structure he'd built with his own hands, back when hope still lived in his heart. The logs were chinked tight against winter's bite, the roof solid and true, but the interior felt as empty as a church on Monday morning. Samuel's chair still sat by the stone hearth, untouched since that bright spring day in 1867, when his boy had kissed his weathered cheek and ridden off to join the Union cause. The war had been over for 5 years now. But Samuel Boone never came home. Jed reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small daguerreotype, its edges worn smooth from countless handlings. Samuel's young face stared back at him, serious and proud in his blue uniform, chin lifted with the confidence of youth. 18 years old, and certain he could help heal a broken nation. The photographer had captured something in the boy's eyes, a light that reminded Jed of his late wife. "Martha, may she rest in peace." "Should have stopped him," Jed whispered to the photograph, "as he had 1,000 times before. Should have tied you to the barn post and kept you safe." But Martha's voice echoed in his memory. "Gentle as summer rain, you can't cage a eagle's heart." Jed let the boy fly, so he had let Samuel fly, and the boy had never returned to the nest. The general store's bell jangled as Jed pushed through the door, his boots heavy on the worn wooden planks. Magnus Cordell looked up from his ledger, his expression shifting from welcome to wariness. Most folks in Dry Creek had grown tired of Jed's melancholy, though they were too polite to say so directly. "Morning, Jed," Magnus said, his voice carefully neutral. "What brings you in today?" "Need supplies for the winter," Jed replied, though his heart wasn't in the words. What was the point of preparing for winter when every day felt like an endless season of cold? Magnus nodded toward the shelves lined with flour sacks, coffee tins, and preserved goods. "Help yourself. Got some good bear fat in yesterday if you're interested." Jed moved through the store like a man in a dream, gathering what he needed. 2 sacks of flour, more than enough for one man who barely ate. A tin of coffee, the only luxury he allowed himself these days. The jar of bear fat would keep him fed when the snows came deep. The bell jangled again, and Pete Morrison burst through the door, his face flushed with excitement and whiskey. "Magnus, you ain't gonna believe what's tied up outside. Some fool's got a horse that's more dead than alive." "What do you mean?" Magnus asked, moving to the window, skinny as a rail, covered in mud, and limping something fierce. "Owner says he's headed to California, needs to travel light. Wants to trade her for supplies." Jed felt a strange stirring in his chest, something he hadn't experienced in years. Curiosity, perhaps, or maybe just the need to step outside his own sorrow for a moment. He followed the other men to the window. Tied to the hitching post stood the most pitiful creature Jed had ever seen. The mare was small, no more than 14 hands high, with a coat so matted and filthy that her true color was impossible to determine. Her head hung low, and she favored her left front leg. But it was her eyes that caught Jed's attention, dark as storm clouds, but somehow still holding a spark of dignity beneath the weariness. "Poor thing," Magnus muttered. "Ought to be put out of her misery." "Waste of good lead," Pete added with a harsh laugh. The owner emerged from behind the building, a thin man in a battered hat who looked as worn down as his horse. "Name's Collins," he called out. "Anyone interested in a trade? She's gentle as a lamb, just needs some rest and feed. What you want for her?" Magnus asked, though his tone suggested he thought Collins was wasting everyone's time. 2 sacks of flour, coffee, and whatever fat you can spare. They got a long road ahead and winter coming fast. The men erupted in laughter. Pete slapped his knee and shook his head. "Mister, you could get more for that horse's hide than she's worth alive." But Jed wasn't laughing. He found himself walking toward the door, drawn by something he couldn't name. The worn leather gloves on his hands suddenly felt warm, as if they remembered their purpose. "Hold on there," he said quietly. The group fell silent, surprised by Jed's intervention. Collins looked hopeful for the first time since arriving in Dry Creek. "You serious about that trade?" Jed asked. "Jed, don't be a fool," Magnus warned. "That horse won't last the week." But Jed had moved closer to the mare, and she had lifted her head to look at him. In those storm cloud eyes, he saw something familiar, a soul that had been beaten down but not broken, a spirit that had endured loss and kept breathing because surrender wasn't in her nature. "What's her name?" Jed asked. Collins shrugged. "Never gave her one. Just called her Horse." Jed reached out slowly, letting the mare catch his scent. Her nostrils fluttered, and to everyone's amazement she took a small step forward. When his gloved hand touched her neck, she didn't flinch. Instead, she seemed to lean into his touch, as if starved for kindness. "I'll take the trade," Jed said quietly. The crowd behind him erupted in protests and warnings, but Jed barely heard them. He was remembering Martha's voice, the way she used to rescue wounded birds and nurse them back to health in their kitchen. "Every creature deserves a chance," she'd say. "Sometimes love is all the medicine they need." Magnus tried one last time to talk sense into him. "Jed, think about this. Winter's coming, and you're trading away your supplies for a horse that can't even carry her own weight." Jed pulled his gaze away from the mare's eyes and looked at his old friend. "Sometimes a man's got to follow his heart, Magnus. Mine's been dead for 3 years. Maybe it's time I listen to what's left of it." The transaction took only minutes. Collins loaded Jed's winter supplies into his wagon with obvious relief and headed west without looking back. The townspeople dispersed, shaking their heads and muttering about poor judgment and winter preparations. But Jed stood beside his new companion in the gathering dusk, one weathered hand resting on her neck, and for the first time in years, he felt something stir in his chest besides grief. "Well, girl," he said softly, "I reckon you need a proper name. How about Clementine? Had a aunt by that name once. Stubborn as a mule, but had the biggest heart in the county." The mare turned her head toward him, and Jed could swear he saw understanding in those storm cloud eyes. Maybe even gratitude. As the first stars appeared over the mountains, Jed Boone led Clementine home, unaware that this simple act of compassion would change both their lives in ways he could never have imagined. In his vest pocket, Samuel's photograph rested against his heart, and for the first time since his boy rode away, Jed felt like he was walking toward something instead of away from everything that mattered. The future stretched ahead like an uncharted trail, full of promise and possibility. And for the first time in 3 long years, that didn't seem like such a frightening prospect. The first challenge came with the dawn. Jed woke to find Clementine standing in the corner of his small barn, trembling despite the blanket he'd thrown over her the night before. Her breathing was labored, and when he approached with a handful of oats, she shied away from the feed bucket as if expecting a blow. "Easy there, girl," he murmured, setting the bucket down and backing away. "Nobody's gonna hurt you here." It took the better part of an hour before hunger overcame fear, and Clementine finally approached the oats. Jed watched from the barn door as she ate, noting how she kept one eye on him at all times, ready to bolt at the first sign of threat. Whatever this mare had endured before arriving in Dry Creek had left scars deeper than the physical ones he could see. Dr. William Henley arrived that afternoon, his medical bag in one hand and a skeptical expression on his weathered face. The town's physician also served as its veterinarian when needed, though he made no secret of his preference for human patients. "Magnus sent me," he explained, eyeing Clementine with professional detachment. "Said you'd taken leave of your senses and needed someone to talk reason into you." Jed bristled, but kept his voice calm. "I need someone to look at her leg, Doc, see if she can be helped." Henley approached the mare with the careful movements of a man who'd been kicked by enough horses to respect their unpredictability. Clementine tensed but allowed the examination, perhaps sensing the doctor's clinical touch was different from whatever rough handling she'd known before. "Well?" Jed asked when Henley stepped back, wiping his hands on a cloth. "The limp isn't from any break or permanent injury," the doctor admitted reluctantly. "Appears to be a stone bruise that's been aggravated by poor shoeing and neglect. With proper care and rest, she should recover fully." Relief flooded through Jed's chest, followed immediately by a surge of anger at Collins and whoever had mistreated this gentle creature before him. "How long?" 2 weeks, maybe 3. "Keep her stall clean, check that hoof daily for signs of infection, and don't try to ride her until the tenderness is completely gone." Henley paused, studying Jed's face. "You realize this doesn't change the fundamental problem, don't you?" "What problem?" "Winter, Jed. You traded away your food supplies for a horse you can't work and can't afford to feed. Noble gesture, perhaps, but nobility doesn't fill an empty belly when the snows come." After the doctor left, Jed sat on an overturned bucket in the barn, watching Clementine as she rested in the straw. The weight of his decision was beginning to settle on his shoulders like a heavy pack. He had enough food in his pantry to last maybe 3 weeks if he rationed carefully. After that, he'd be dependent on hunting and what little he could trade for his furs. But when he looked at Clementine, seeing how her breathing had already improved with rest and proper feed, he couldn't bring himself to regret the choice. There was something about her quiet dignity that reminded him of Martha's strength during her final illness, a refusal to surrender even when the odds were stacked against survival. That evening, as October's chill settled over the valley, Jed made another discovery that would change everything. While grooming Clementine with an old horsebrush he'd found in the barn, he noticed her coat was beginning to shed the layers of dirt and neglect. Underneath the grime, patches of deep chestnut were emerging, shot through with streaks of gold that caught the lamplight like burnished copper. But it was her build that truly caught his attention as she began to fill out with proper feeding. Despite her small stature, her chest was deep and her legs were straight and strong. Her head, now that he could see it clearly, was refined and intelligent, with the dished face and arched neck of breeding stock. "Where did you come from, girl?" he wondered aloud, running his hands along her neck. That night, unable to sleep for thinking about the puzzle Clementine represented, Jed lit a lamp and opened the wooden chest where he kept Martha's things. Beneath her wedding dress and prayer book, he found what he was looking for: a leather-bound journal she'd kept about the animals they'd owned over the years. Martha had been raised back in Virginia, and her father had bred horses before the war changed everything. As Jed read her careful notes about bloodlines and breeding, a memory stirred. Martha had once told him about a breed her father prized above all others: small, hardy horses from the Shenandoah Valley, bred for strength and endurance on mountain trails. The railroad companies had paid premium prices for them before the war scattered the breeding stock to the winds. "Virginia mountain horses," he whispered, looking toward the barn where Clementine rested. The next morning brought visitors, unwelcome ones. Pete Morrison arrived with 2 other men Jed recognized from town, their expressions a mixture of concern and barely concealed amusement. "Come to check on your investment," Pete said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Word's getting around that you've lost your grip on reality. Jed, some folks are talking about having Doc Henley declare you unfit to manage your own affairs." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a green fire, acrid and choking. Jed felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his voice level. "That so? Now, we don't want any trouble," said Ben Crawford, the town's banker. But when a man starts making decisions that could see him starve come winter, well, the community has a responsibility to step in. "Appreciate your concern," Jed replied, his tone suggesting the opposite. "But I'm managing just fine," Pete snorted. "Fine? You traded your winter supplies for a broken-down nag that'll probably be dead before Christmas." "How is that fine?" From inside the barn came a soft whinny, and Jed felt a surge of protective anger that surprised him with its intensity. These men saw only weakness where he was beginning to see strength. "Only failure where he sensed the possibility of redemption, gentlemen," he said quietly. "I'm going to ask you to leave my property now." The three men exchanged glances, and Ben Crawford stepped forward. "Jed, be reasonable. We're trying to help. If you can't see past your grief to make sound decisions, get off my land." Jed's voice carried a steel that made all three men take a step back. For a moment, the broken widower disappeared, replaced by the mountain man who had once faced down grizzlies and survived blizzards that claimed weaker souls. After they left, Jed stood in his doorway, watching their retreating figures and feeling the weight of their words. Maybe they were right. Maybe his grief had clouded his judgment. Maybe he was a foolish old man, throwing away his future for the sake of a damaged horse. But when he turned toward the barn and saw Clementine watching him through the open door, her storm-cloud eyes filled with what looked like understanding, he knew he'd made the right choice. Not the practical choice, perhaps, but the right one. That night, as he sat beside her stall, reading aloud from Martha's journal, Clementine moved closer to the rail that separated them. When he reached out tentatively, she didn't pull away. Instead, she rested her muzzle against his palm, and Jed felt something crack open in his chest, not breaking, but blooming, like ice giving way to spring. For the first time since Samuel rode away to war, Jedediah Boone wasn't alone with his grief. And somehow that made all the difference in the world. 2 weeks into November, the first serious snow arrived with a vengeance that reminded every soul in Dry Creek why winter preparation mattered. Jed woke to find 6 inches of powder blanketing his cabin roof and more falling steadily from a grey sky that promised no mercy. His pantry shelves, once comfortably stocked for a solitary winter, now looked sparse and accusing in the dim morning light. A half-empty flour sack, 2 cans of beans, some dried venison, and precious little else. He'd been eating sparingly, but mathematics didn't lie. At this rate, he'd be facing real hunger before the snows melted. But when he stepped into the barn with Clementine's morning feed, his worries seemed to lighten. The transformation in the mare over the past weeks had been nothing short of remarkable. Her coat now gleamed like burnished copper in the lamplight, revealing the noble lines that breeding had carved into her frame. The limp was completely gone, and she moved with a fluid grace that spoke of hidden strength. More importantly, she'd begun to trust him. When he approached her stall now, she turned toward him instead of away. Her ears pricked forward with what he could only describe as eagerness. Sometimes she would nicker softly when she heard his footsteps, and the sound never failed to warm something deep in his chest. "Good morning, beautiful," he said softly, stroking her neck as she ate. "You're looking more like your true self every day." The old bridle hanging on a nail near her stall had belonged to Martha's favorite riding mare, long dead now, but remembered fondly. Jed had cleaned and oiled the leather until it was supple again, thinking perhaps it was time to see how Clementine responded to tack. She stood quietly as he slipped the bridle over her head, her dark eyes watching his every movement, but showing no fear. When he led her out of the stall, she followed willingly, her hooves ringing clear and true on the barn's packed earth floor. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but Clementine seemed invigorated by the cold air. She lifted her head high and stepped forward with purpose, and Jed felt a surge of pride watching her move. Whatever bloodlines ran through her veins, they were good ones. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted his admiration. Through the swirling snow came Magnus Cordell, hunched against the cold on his sturdy bay gelding. The store owner's face was grim as he dismounted. "Jed, we need to talk." "Come inside where it's warm," Jed offered, but Magnus shook his head. "This won't take long." "I've got bad news. Collins is dead." The words hit Jed like a physical blow. "What happened?" "Froze to death 3 days west of here. Searchers found his body yesterday, along with what was left of your supplies. Looks like he got caught in the storm without proper shelter." Magnus paused, studying Jed's face. "Thing is, they also found this in his wagon." He handed Jed a small leather pouch that clinked with the sound of metal. Inside were 3 gold coins and a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. Jed's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded it, revealing faded ink in a woman's careful handwriting. "Certificate of bloodline registration," he read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. "Virginia Mountain Horse, Damn Sweet Caroline of Shenandoah. Sire, Thunder Mountain King." He looked up at Magnus, his eyes wide with understanding. "This is Clementine's breeding record." Magnus whistled low. "Virginia Mountain Horses. I heard tell of them years ago. Railroad companies used to pay a small fortune for horses that could navigate mountain passes with heavy loads." Jed's mind raced as he studied the document. According to the certificate, Clementine, registered name Carolina's Storm, was the daughter of championship bloodstock that had been scattered during the war. Her lineage traced back to the most prized horses in the Shenandoah Valley, bred specifically for their combination of strength, endurance, and sure-footedness on treacherous terrain. "Collins knew," Jed said quietly. "He knew what she was worth and still let her suffer. Appears so. Question is, what are you going to do with this information?" Before Jed could answer, another horse and rider appeared through the snow. This time it was Dr. Henley, his black bag secured behind his saddle and his expression more troubled than usual. "Magnus, Jed, glad I found you both. We've got a problem in town. Young Tommy Henderson took a bad fall from his pony yesterday. Broke his leg clean through, and it's not setting right. I need to get him to the territorial capital for proper surgery. But no horse in town can make that journey through these mountain passes in winter weather." The 2 men looked at each other, understanding dawning in their eyes. The territorial capital was a 3-day ride through some of the most treacherous mountain terrain in Montana. Most horses would struggle with the elevation and rocky trails, even in good weather. In winter, it was considered nearly impossible. "What about the stage line?" Magnus asked. "Next stage isn't due for 2 weeks, and the boy can't wait that long. Infection's already setting in." Henley's voice carried the weight of professional desperation. "I need a horse that can navigate mountain trails with a heavy load and get there fast." Jed felt all eyes turn toward Clementine, who had been standing quietly beside him throughout the conversation. The mare seemed to sense the attention, lifting her head with quiet dignity as snowflakes gathered on her copper coat. "She's not even been under saddle yet," Jed protested, though his heart was already racing with possibility. "But she's got the breeding for it," Magnus said quietly. "If that certificate is real, and if she's truly from Virginia mountain stock, she might be the only horse in the territory that can make that journey." Dr. Henley stepped closer to Clementine, his trained eye assessing her confirmation. "She's got the chest for high-altitude work, and those legs look strong enough for mountain terrain. Question is, do you trust her enough to try?" Jed looked into Clementine's storm-cloud eyes and saw something that took his breath away. Not fear or uncertainty, but calm readiness, as if she understood what was being asked of her and was prepared to answer the call. In that moment, he realized this was why she had come into his life, not just to heal his heart, but to prove that sometimes the most unlikely heroes emerge from the most desperate circumstances. "Tommy Henderson's just a boy," he said quietly. "Barely 14, Henley confirmed. "Same age as—" He stopped himself, but the words hung in the air anyway. "Same age as Samuel had been when Jed first taught him to ride." The decision crystallized in Jed's mind with perfect clarity. He had spent 3 years mourning his inability to save his son. Now fate was offering him a chance to save someone else's child, and the instrument of that salvation was the broken-down mare everyone had called worthless. "When do we leave?" he asked. The relief on Henley's face was answer enough. The preparations took the better part of the day, and with each passing hour, young Tommy Henderson's condition grew more precarious. Dr. Henley had fashioned a makeshift stretcher that could be secured behind Clementine's saddle, but the real test would be whether an untrained horse could handle the weight and maintain her footing on icy mountain trails. Jed worked with quiet efficiency, drawing on skills he hadn't used since Samuel was a boy learning to handle pack animals. Martha's old saddle, carefully preserved these past years, fit Clementine perfectly, another sign that fate had been at work long before any of them understood its design. "Easy, girl," he murmured as he tightened the cinch. Clementine stood rock-steady, her ears forward and alert, but showing no sign of nervousness. It was as if she understood the gravity of their mission. Agnes Henderson arrived as the sun was setting, her face streaked with tears and her hands trembling as she approached Clementine. "This horse is really going to save my boy?" Jed's throat tightened at the desperate hope in her voice. "She's going to try, Mrs. Henderson. That's all any of us can do." The woman reached out tentatively to stroke Clementine's neck, and the mare lowered her head gently, as if offering comfort. "She's beautiful," Agnes whispered. "I can't believe anyone ever called her worthless." As the last of the equipment was secured, Magnus pulled Jed aside. "You sure about this? It's been years since you've ridden those high passes. And never in winter conditions like this." Jed nodded toward the Henderson house, where lamplight spilled from the windows, and the shadow of a mother keeping vigil could be seen through the curtains. "That boy needs help that only the territorial capital can provide. If we don't try, he dies. And if you don't make it through the passes..." The question hung in the cold air between them like a challenge. Jed thought of Samuel, riding off to war with such confidence in his young heart, never imagining he wouldn't come home. Life offered no guarantees, only choices that defined a man's character. Then at least we'll have tried to save him instead of watching him die. Dr. Henley emerged from the Henderson house, his medical bag in hand and his face grave. "The boy's fever is climbing. We need to leave within the hour if we're going to have any chance." The final test came when they loaded Tommy onto the stretcher. The 14-year-old was delirious with pain and fever, his broken leg immobilized, but clearly causing him agony with every movement. As they secured him behind the saddle, Clementine turned her head to look back at her burden, her dark eyes taking in the situation with an intelligence that sent chills down Jed's spine. "She knows," Dr. Henley said quietly. "Look at how she's positioning herself." Indeed, Clementine had shifted her stance to better distribute the weight, her muscles adjusting automatically to compensate for the added load. When Tommy moaned softly in his delirium, she nickered in response, not the sharp call of alarm, but a low, comforting sound that seemed to ease the boy's distress. As they prepared to depart, the entire population of Dry Creek seemed to materialize from the swirling snow. Word had spread quickly about the desperate mission, and neighbors who had questioned Jed's sanity just weeks before now watched with hushed respect as he mounted up beside his remarkable mare. "Godspeed, Jed," called out Ben Crawford, the banker who had threatened to have Jed declared incompetent. "Bring that boy home safe." Pete Morrison stepped forward, his earlier mockery replaced by something approaching shame. "Jed, I owe you an apology. Reckon we all do." But Jed's attention was focused on the trail ahead, where moonlight reflected off the snow-covered peaks that stood between them and salvation. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and the wind carried the promise of more snow before morning. "Ready, Doc?" he called. Dr. Henley, mounted on his sturdy gelding, nodded grimly. "Lead the way." The first mile passed without incident as they followed the familiar trail that led up from the valley floor. Clementine moved with confident strides, her breathing steady and her footing sure despite the treacherous conditions. Behind them, Tommy had lapsed into an uneasy quiet that worried Henley more than the boy's earlier moaning. "How's he doing?" Jed called back, "Still with us, but his pulse is weak. We need to make good time." As they climbed higher into the mountains, the trail grew narrower and more treacherous. Ice-covered rocks jutted from the path like teeth, and more than once, Jed felt his heart skip as Clementine navigated around obstacles that would have challenged an experienced mountain horse in daylight. But she never faltered. Her small hooves found purchase where larger horses would have slipped, and her compact frame allowed her to squeeze through narrow passages that would have blocked a bigger animal. With each successful negotiation of a difficult section, Jed's confidence in her abilities grew. The real test came at Eagle's Crossing, where the trail wound around a sheer cliff face with a drop of several hundred feet on one side and a wall of ice-covered rock on the other. In daylight, with good weather, it was challenging enough. In darkness, with snow falling and a precious cargo to protect, it seemed almost impossible. Jesus, Dr. Henley breathed as they approached the crossing. Maybe we should turn back. Jed studied the narrow ledge ahead, calculating distances and angles with the eye of a man who had spent decades reading mountain terrain. She can make it, he said quietly. Question is, do we trust her enough to try? Clementine seemed to sense his hesitation. She took a step forward and nickered softly, as if encouraging him to have faith in her capabilities. In her storm-cloud eyes, Jed saw not just intelligence but determination, the same quality he had recognized in Samuel all those years ago. "All right, girl," he whispered. "Show us what Virginia mountain horses can do." What happened next would be talked about in Dry Creek for generations to come. Step by careful step, Clementine made her way along that treacherous ledge, her hooves finding solid purchase on surfaces that looked like certain death. She moved with the grace of a dancer and the precision of a watchmaker, never rushing, never hesitating, carrying her precious burden through a passage that lesser horses couldn't have managed in perfect conditions. When they finally reached solid ground on the far side, Dr. Henley's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold his reins. "In 40 years of medicine," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion, "I have never seen anything like that." But Jed was already looking ahead to the next challenge, his heart filled with a pride and hope he hadn't felt since Samuel was alive. Clementine had proven herself worthy of her noble bloodline, and they still had 2 days of mountain travel ahead of them. The night was far from over, but for the first time in years, Jedediah Boone felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Dawn broke grey and bitter over the high mountain camp where they had stopped to rest. Jed had found shelter in a shallow cave he remembered from his trapping days. Big enough to protect them from the wind, but open enough that Clementine could stand comfortably inside, with Tommy still secured to the stretcher on her back. The boy's condition had worsened during the night. His fever burned high enough that Dr. Henley had stopped trying to hide his worry, and his broken leg showed signs of infection that made the physician mutter darkly about time running short. They had covered maybe half the distance to the territorial capital, but the worst terrain still lay ahead. "We need to push harder today," Henley said, as he checked Tommy's pulse for the 3rd time in an hour. "If we don't get him to surgery soon—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Jed understood. The boy was dying slowly, and their desperate mission would become a futile race against time. What troubled Jed more than the medical urgency was the change he sensed in Clementine. During their brief rest, she had refused the oats he offered, and her breathing seemed more labored than it should have been given the pace they had maintained. When he ran his hands along her legs, checking for injury, she flinched slightly at his touch. "Something wrong with her?" Henley asked, noticing Jed's concern. "Not sure. She's favoring her right side a little. Could be the cold affecting her muscles, or maybe the weight of the stretcher is wearing on her more than she's letting on." As if she had heard them talking about her, Clementine turned her head and nuzzled Jed's shoulder with her soft muzzle. In her storm-cloud eyes, he saw something that made his chest tight, not pain or exhaustion, but a quiet determination to continue regardless of the cost to herself. "You're pushing too hard, aren't you, girl?" he whispered, stroking her neck. "Just like your old master used to do." The thought struck him with sudden clarity. According to the breeding certificate, Clementine had been sired by Thunder Mountain King, a stallion renowned for his willingness to work until he collapsed rather than disappoint his rider. That same trait, noble to a fault, might be driving Clementine beyond her physical limits as they prepared to resume the journey. An unexpected sound drifted up from the valley below. Voices growing stronger as they approached. Dr. Henley grabbed his rifle while Jed moved to Clementine's head, ready to quiet her if she showed any sign of whinnying. 3 men on horseback appeared through the trees, their clothes marking them as travelers rather than locals. The leader, a big man with a grey beard and expensive boots, called out when he spotted their camp. "Hello there! Mind if we share your fire for a few minutes?" "We're about froze through." Dr. Henley kept his rifle ready but nodded permission. As the strangers dismounted, Jed noticed their horses. Fine animals, well-fed and perfectly groomed, but already showing signs of struggle with the high altitude and difficult terrain. "Name's William Cartwright," the bearded man said, extending a gloved hand. "These are my associates, Mr. Blake and Mr. Stevens. We're surveying potential railroad routes through these mountains." Railroad. The word hit Jed like a physical blow as he remembered Martha's journal entries about the premium prices paid for mountain horses before the war. If these men were scouting for the railroad, they would know the value of what they were seeing. "That's quite a horse you've got there," Blake observed, his eyes studying Clementine's conformation with obvious expertise. "Unusual to see her type this far west. She's just a local mare," Jed replied carefully. But he could see the skepticism in the surveyor's face. Stevens had moved closer to examine Clementine, and his sharp intake of breath confirmed Jed's fears. "Good Lord, that's a Virginia mountain horse. I'd swear by her bloodlines that she's from the Thunder Mountain King line." The 3 surveyors exchanged meaningful glances, and Cartwright stepped forward with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Gentlemen, you may not realize what you have here. That mare is worth a considerable sum to the right buyer, specifically to the railroad company I represent." "She's not for sale," Jed said flatly. "Everything's for sale at the right price. We're authorized to offer up to $5,000 for proven mountain stock. $5,000. The sum hung in the cold mountain air like a golden promise. More money than Jed had seen in his entire life, enough to buy a dozen farms or start a new life anywhere he chose. Behind him, he heard Dr. Henley's sharp intake of breath, but when Jed looked at Clementine, standing patiently with Tommy Henderson strapped to her back, suffering in silence so that a boy might live, the decision was easier than breathing. "I told you, she's not for sale." Cartwright's smile faded, replaced by the hard expression of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Mr. Boone, yes, we know who you are. You're being foolish. That horse is wasted on a broken-down trapper living in poverty. We could give her the care and purpose she deserves." "The purpose she deserves is saving that boy's life," Jed replied, his voice carrying the steel that had once faced down grizzlies and claim jumpers. Stevens tried a different approach. "What if we offered to escort you to the capital with our horses? You could complete your mission and still make the sale, with your horses." Jed gestured toward their mounts, which were already showing signs of distress from the high altitude. "Those animals wouldn't last another mile in this terrain. Clementine's the only horse in these mountains that can make this journey, and she's going to finish it." The 3 men exchanged frustrated glances, clearly unaccustomed to having their offers refused. Blake stepped forward, his hand resting meaningfully on his gun belt. "Perhaps you don't understand the situation, old man. The railroad is coming through these mountains, whether you cooperate or not. It would be better for everyone if we could settle this amicably." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Dr. Henley raised his rifle slightly, and the tension in the small camp became palpable. But it was Clementine who broke the standoff, stepping forward with Tommy still on her back and placing herself between Jed and the strangers. In that moment, the mare's intelligence and loyalty were unmistakable. She understood the danger and had positioned herself to protect both her master and the wounded boy, despite her own exhaustion and pain. Cartwright studied the scene for a long moment, then shook his head in disgust. "You're making a mistake, Boone. The railroad remembers its friends and its enemies." As the 3 surveyors mounted their struggling horses and disappeared down the trail, Dr. Henley lowered his rifle and looked at Jed with newfound respect. $5,000, Jed. You just turned down more money than most men see in a lifetime." Jed stroked Clementine's neck, feeling the strength and courage that flowed beneath her copper coat. Some things can't be bought, Doc. Loyalty is one of them. Trust is another. From the stretcher came a soft moan, reminding them both that time was still their enemy. But as they resumed their journey into the high peaks, Jed felt a new confidence in their mission. Clementine had proven herself capable of facing any challenge, and he was beginning to understand that her true value had nothing to do with money. The afternoon brought them to Devil's Backbone, the most treacherous stretch of mountain trail in the territory. Here the path narrowed to barely 4 feet wide, with a sheer drop on one side that disappeared into mist and jagged rocks jutting from the mountain face on the other. Even in good weather, seasoned mountaineers approached this passage with respect bordering on reverence. In the growing storm, with ice coating every surface and visibility reduced to mere yards, it seemed like madness to attempt the crossing. Tommy's condition had deteriorated further during the morning's travel. His fever had broken twice, leaving him drenched in sweat that froze almost immediately in the bitter air, and his moments of consciousness were marked by delirious rambling about his mother and the pony that had thrown him. Dr. Henley's face had taken on the grim expression of a man watching death approach despite his best efforts. "We have to try," Henley said when Jed voiced his concerns about the passage ahead. "If we turn back now or wait for better weather, the boy won't see another sunrise." Clementine stood at the entrance to Devil's Backbone, her breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. Jed could feel the tremor in her muscles, the exhaustion that she had been hiding out of sheer determination. Her right foreleg was definitely favoring now, though she tried to mask it when she thought he was watching. "Girl, you've already given more than anyone had a right to ask," he whispered into her ear. "No one would blame you if you couldn't make this last push." In response, Clementine stepped forward onto the icy ledge, her hooves finding purchase with the instinctive precision of her mountain-bred ancestors. It was as clear an answer as any words could have provided. The crossing began in tense silence, broken only by the wind whistling through the peaks and the careful clip-clop of Clementine's hooves on stone. Dr. Henley followed on his gelding, but it quickly became apparent that his horse was struggling with both the narrow footing and the altitude. Halfway across, disaster struck. A sudden gust of wind caught them exposed on the ledge, and Henley's gelding stumbled, his hooves sliding on a patch of black ice. The horse whinnied in terror as he scrambled for purchase, his hindquarters swinging dangerously close to the edge. "Whoa, easy," Henley shouted, but panic had seized his mount. The gelding reared, nearly throwing his rider, and for a horrible moment it looked like both horse and man would plunge into the abyss. Clementine's response was immediate and extraordinary. Despite carrying Tommy's weight and fighting her own exhaustion, she backed carefully along the narrow ledge until she was close enough to stretch her neck toward the terrified gelding. Her calm presence seemed to steady the panicked horse, and she nickered softly, a sound that somehow cut through the wind and fear to reach him. The gelding's wild eyes fixed on Clementine, and gradually his panic subsided. Step by careful step, with her encouragement, he regained his footing and moved away from the precipice. "My God," Dr. Henley breathed. She saved us both, but the effort had cost Clementine dearly. Jed could see her trembling now, not from cold, but from exhaustion pushed beyond reasonable limits. Her breathing was labored, and when she took her next step, the limp in her right foreleg was unmistakable. They had reached a small widening in the trail, barely large enough for both horses to stand safely, when Jed made a decision that went against every practical instinct he possessed. "Doc, we need to rest here for a few minutes. Jed, the boy, won't be helped if Clementine collapses trying to carry him." "Look at her." Dr. Henley followed his gaze and saw what Jed had been trying to ignore. Clementine was favoring her right leg significantly now, and her head hung lower than it had all day. The noble mare who had carried them through impossible terrain was finally showing the effects of her heroic effort, as they sheltered in the slight protection of an overhanging rock. Jed examined Clementine's leg as best he could in the difficult conditions. What he found made his heart sink. The old stone bruise had reopened under the stress of the journey, and her hoof was warm with inflammation. "It's not just fatigue," he told Henley quietly. "She's genuinely injured now. Every step must be causing her real pain." From the stretcher came a weak voice, the first coherent words Tommy had spoken in hours. "Is the horse hurt because of me?" Both men turned to look at the boy, whose fever-bright eyes showed more awareness than they had seen since leaving Dry Creek. "Don't you worry about that, son," Jed said gently. "Clementine knew what she was getting into when she took this job." "She's beautiful," Tommy whispered. "Like the horses in my storybooks. Is she really going to carry me all the way to the doctor?" Jed met Dr. Henley's eyes over the boy's head. They both knew the truth. Clementine was pushing herself beyond her physical limits, out of pure heart. But heart alone might not be enough to complete the journey. It was then that Jed remembered something from Martha's journal, a passage about the Thunder Mountain King bloodline that he had read but not fully understood until this moment. The great stallion had been famous not just for his endurance, but for his ability to find reserves of strength when lives depended on him. It was as if the horses of that line understood when they carried more than just riders, when they carried hope itself. "Tommy," Jed said, his voice rough with emotion, "I want you to do something for me. Can you reach out and touch Clementine's neck?" The boy's small hand emerged from beneath the blankets and rested on the mare's copper coat. Immediately Clementine turned her head to look back at him, her storm cloud eyes gentle despite her pain. "Tell her thank you," Jed whispered. "Tell her what it means to your mama that she's trying to save you." "Thank you, Clementine," Tommy said softly. "Mama says angels watch over little boys, but I think sometimes they come with 4 legs and a kind heart." The mare nickered in response, and something seemed to pass between horse and boy in that moment, an understanding that transcended words. When Clementine straightened up and took a step forward, her limp was still there, but her spirit seemed renewed. "She's ready to go on," Dr. Henley observed with wonder in his voice. As they prepared to tackle the final stretch of Devil's Backbone, Jed felt a profound humility wash over him. He had thought he was saving Clementine when he made that foolish trade in Dry Creek, but the truth was more complex. She was saving him from his grief, from his isolation, and from the bitter cynicism that had been eating away at his soul since Samuel died. Now, as she prepared to risk everything for a boy she barely knew, Clementine was teaching him the most important lesson of all, that true wealth had nothing to do with gold coins or comfortable circumstances, and everything to do with the willingness to sacrifice for others. The capital city was still hours away, but Jed knew now that they would make it. Not because the journey had gotten easier, but because they were no longer traveling alone. They carried the hopes and prayers of everyone who loved them, and that was a load that even a Virginia mountain horse could bear with pride. They reached the territorial capital just as the sun set behind the western peaks, painting the sky the color of fresh blood. Clementine's hooves rang hollow on the wooden planks of the main street as they made their way to the territorial hospital, a modest 2-story building that represented civilization's furthest outpost in the wilderness. Dr. Henley had sent word ahead with a rider they'd encountered on the outskirts of town, and a medical team was waiting when they arrived. As careful hands lifted Tommy from the stretcher, Clementine stood with her legs splayed wide, finally allowing her exhaustion to show now that her burden was safely delivered. "Good girl," Jed whispered, his own legs unsteady as he dismounted. "You did it. You saved him." The territorial surgeon, Dr. Marcus Webb, was a thin man with prematurely grey hair and hands that moved with the precise confidence of years spent mending broken bodies on the frontier. After a quick examination of Tommy, he nodded grimly to Dr. Henley. "You got him here just in time. Another few hours, and we would have lost him to the infection. As it is, the surgery will be touch and go." As Tommy was carried into the hospital, he managed one last look back at Clementine. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice so soft it was almost lost in the evening bustle of the town. Jed led Clementine to the livery stable, where the hostler took one look at the exhausted mare and shook his head in amazement. "Mister, I don't know what that horse has been through, but she's about used up. You push her much further, and she'll be no good to anyone." That night, as Clementine rested in a warm stall with fresh hay and oats, Jed sat in the saloon across the street, nursing a whiskey and trying to process what they had accomplished. The adrenaline of the desperate journey was wearing off, replaced by a bone-deep weariness that made him feel every one of his 52 years. It was there that fate dealt its final hand. A well-dressed stranger approached his table, removing his hat to reveal silver hair and the bearing of a man accustomed to authority. "Mr. Boone, my name is Colonel James Patterson, and I believe we have much to discuss." Jed looked up warily, remembering his encounter with the railroad surveyors. "If you're here about buying my horse, you're wasting your time." Patterson smiled and took the seat across from him without invitation. "Oh, I'm not here to buy her, Mr. Boone. I'm here to tell you who she really is." The colonel reached into his coat and withdrew a leather portfolio, from which he extracted several documents and a faded photograph. 20 years ago, I was a young cavalry officer stationed in Virginia, tasked with procuring horses for the Union Army. This is a photograph of the finest stallion I ever encountered, Thunder Mountain King. Jed found himself looking at a picture of a magnificent horse, clearly the sire of Clementine's distinctive features. But what caught his attention was the young soldier holding the stallion's lead rope, a face he recognized despite the passage of 20 years. "Samuel," he breathed, "your son was assigned to my unit for 3 months in 1868, helping to relocate the surviving Virginia mountain horses before they fell into Confederate hands. He spoke of you often. Mr. Boone spoke of a father who taught him that a man's worth wasn't measured in gold, but in the kindness he showed to those who couldn't help themselves." The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Patterson continued. "Samuel was killed trying to save these horses. Mr. Boone, a Confederate raid caught us moving the herd, and your son died defending a pregnant mare, the same mare that would later give birth to the horse you call Clementine." Jed's hands trembled as he reached for the whiskey glass, his mind struggling to process this revelation. Samuel hadn't died in some meaningless skirmish or distant battle. He had died protecting the very bloodline that had now saved Tommy Henderson's life. "I don't understand," Jed managed. "How did Clementine end up with Collins? How did she get to Dry Creek?" Patterson's expression grew darker. "That's the tragedy of it, Mr. Boone. After the war, the surviving horses were scattered. Some went to private breeders, others were sold to settle debts. Clementine, Carolina Storm was her registered name, ended up in the hands of a man named Garrett, who used her brutally and sold her when she could no longer work to his satisfaction. She passed through a dozen owners over the years, each one seeing only a small, unremarkable mare instead of the treasure she truly was, until Collins. Collins was actually my agent. Mr. Boone, I've been searching for the surviving Thunder Mountain horses for 15 years, trying to preserve what's left of the bloodline. When Collins found Clementine in a trader's lot, half dead from neglect, he was supposed to bring her to me. But something went wrong. Maybe the weather, maybe his conscience. Instead, he ended up in Dry Creek, and fate put her in your hands." Jed stared at the photograph of his son, seeing Samuel's gentle smile and remembering the boy's love for all living creatures. "He would have wanted her to be saved more than that," Patterson said quietly. "He made me promise something before he died. Made me swear that if I ever found the foal of the mare he died protecting, I would ensure she ended up with someone who would love her as she deserved to be loved, not use her for profit." The implications of this revelation crashed over Jed like an avalanche. Samuel hadn't just died in the war. He had died protecting the very bloodline that would eventually heal his father's broken heart. Clementine wasn't just a lucky find or a charitable impulse. She was Samuel's final gift, delivered across 20 years and 1,000 miles of hardship to find her way to the one man who needed her most. "There's more," Patterson continued, producing another document from his portfolio. When Samuel died, he left instructions for his personal effects to be held until the war's end, and then distributed according to his wishes. Most of it went to you, of course, but he left something specific for the owner of Carolina's storm. Should she ever be found, he handed Jed a sealed envelope, yellowed with age, but still bearing Samuel's careful handwriting, for the guardian of my foal. With shaking hands, Jed broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. Samuel's familiar script swam before his eyes as he read words written by a young man who had somehow known he wouldn't survive to deliver them himself. Dear friend, if you are reading this, then Carolina's storm has found her way to someone who sees her true worth. I pray that someone is my father, for there is no man alive with a gentler hand or a kinder heart with wounded creatures. This mare's mother died trying to protect her foal from men who would have used her poorly. I died trying to protect them both. But death is just another frontier, and love finds a way to cross even that divide. Take care of her, and she will take care of you. In this broken world, that is miracle enough for any man. Your obedient servant, Samuel Boone. Tears ran unchecked down Jed's weathered cheeks as he finished reading. Across the table, Colonel Patterson waited respectfully for him to compose himself. He knew, Jed whispered finally. Somehow he knew she would find her way to me. Your son was a remarkable young man, Mr. Boone. He saw connections and possibilities that escaped the rest of us. And he was right about one thing. In this broken world, love does find a way to cross any divide. As if summoned by their conversation, a commotion outside the saloon drew their attention. Through the window, they could see Dr. Webb emerging from the hospital with a broad smile on his face. The surgery was a complete success. He called to the gathering crowd, "The boy will make a full recovery." Jed closed his eyes and felt 20 years of grief begin to lift from his shoulders. Samuel was gone, but his legacy lived on in the mare who had carried a wounded boy to safety and in the lesson he had taught about the transformative power of compassion. When he opened his eyes, Colonel Patterson was watching him with understanding. "So, what will you do now, Mr. Boone? The railroad is still interested in acquiring her, and they have deep pockets." Jed carefully folded Samuel's letter and placed it in his vest pocket next to his son's photograph. Both artifacts would stay with him for the rest of his days, reminders of the invisible threads that connected all living things and the miracles that grew from simple acts of kindness. "I'm going to take her home," he said quietly. "And I'm going to love her as she deserves to be loved, just like Samuel wanted." Colonel Patterson smiled and raised his glass in a toast. "To Samuel Boone, who taught us all that some gifts are worth dying for." Outside, snow began to fall again, but for the first time in years. Winter didn't seem like an enemy to Jedediah Boone. It seemed like a promise that spring would come again, bringing new life and new possibilities to a world made richer by love and sacrifice. The return journey to Dry Creek should have been a triumphant procession, but the revelation of Samuel's connection to Clementine had changed everything. For Jed, as they made their way back through the mountain passes at a more leisurely pace, allowing Clementine time to heal from her injured hoof, he found himself seeing the landscape through new eyes. Every ridge and valley seemed to whisper with the presence of his son, as if Samuel had somehow guided their steps along these very trails 20 years ago. The photograph of his boy standing beside Thunder Mountain King had become a talisman that Jed touched repeatedly throughout each day, marveling at the invisible threads that had woven their lives together across time and distance. Dr. Henley rode beside them in contemplative silence for most of the first day, clearly processing his own thoughts about what they had witnessed. Tommy Henderson's miraculous recovery had been the talk of the territorial capital, but it was the story of Clementine's heritage that had truly captured people's imagination. "Jed," Henley said as they made camp on the second evening, "I've been thinking about what Colonel Patterson told us, about the railroad's interest in the Virginia mountain horses." Jed looked up from where he was examining Clementine's hoof, relieved to find that the inflammation was subsiding. "What about it?" "They're not just interested in buying individual horses. They're planning something bigger, a systematic effort to acquire every Virginia mountain horse they can find for their construction projects through the Rockies. The implication hung heavy in the mountain air. If the railroad was serious about collecting the remnants of the bloodline, they wouldn't be deterred by one man's refusal to sell. They would find other ways to get what they wanted. You think they'll come after Clementine again? Henley nodded grimly. Patterson seemed like an honorable man, but he's not the one making the financial decisions. Those railroad barons don't like taking no for an answer, especially when there's profit involved. That night, as if conjured by their conversation, they heard the sound of multiple horses approaching their camp. Jed reached for his rifle while Clementine lifted her head alertly, her ears pricked toward the sound. 5 riders emerged from the darkness, led by William Cartwright, the railroad surveyor they had encountered on their outbound journey. But this time he wasn't alone. The men with him wore the hard expressions and gun belts of hired professionals. "Mr. Boone," Cartwright called out, his voice carrying a false joviality that fooled no one. "Fancy meeting you out here again? I trust your mission to the capital was successful." "Tommy Henderson will live," Jed replied evenly. "That's all that matters to me." Admirable sentiment. "But now that your charitable deed is done, perhaps we can discuss business like reasonable men." Dr. Henley had positioned himself where he could cover Jed with his rifle, but 5 armed men in the wilderness represented odds that even the best marksman couldn't overcome. Cartwright seemed to sense their disadvantage and smiled. "I've had some very interesting conversations since we last met." Mr. Boone spoke with Colonel Patterson. "Learned all about your horse's remarkable pedigree. Also learned that you've become something of a local hero, the humble mountain man who saved a boy's life with his miraculous mare. Get to your point." "Cartwright, my point is that you've made Clementine famous, and famous horses attract attention. The kind of attention that includes people asking questions about ownership papers and legal documentation." He paused, letting the threat sink in. "You see, we've done some research, and it appears that your horse's previous owner, the late Mr. Collins, may not have had clear title to her when he made that trade with you." The words hit Jed like a physical blow. In all his joy at discovering Clementine's heritage, he hadn't considered the legal implications of her complex ownership history. "You're lying," Dr. Henley said. But his voice lacked conviction. Cartwright produced a thick folder from his saddlebags. Bill of sale from a livestock dealer in Colorado, dated 3 months before Collins arrived in Dry Creek, shows that the horse in question was sold to pay off debts, with clear instructions that she was to be delivered to railroad agents for transportation to California. Jed's heart sank as he realized the trap they were walking into. "Even if that's true, I traded for her in good faith." "Of course you did. But unfortunately, good faith doesn't establish legal ownership when the seller didn't have the right to make the transaction in the first place." Cartwright's smile was predatory now. "However, the railroad is prepared to be reasonable. We'll pay you fair compensation for your time and trouble. Say $200 and take the mare off your hands. No legal challenges, no questions asked. $200. A fraction of Clementine's true value, but more than most men in Dry Creek saw in a year. It was the kind of offer that sounded generous until you realized it was being made with guns backing up the negotiation. Jed looked at Clementine, who was watching the proceedings with intelligent eyes. She seemed to sense the danger, moving closer to him as if offering her protection, despite everything she had already given. "And if I refuse, then we'll have to pursue the matter through proper legal channels. Of course, that could take months, and in the meantime, the horse would need to be held as evidence. Territorial law is very clear about disputed property. It gets impounded until ownership can be established." Cartwright's voice took on a mocking tone. "I imagine that would be quite painful for you, Mr. Boone, being separated from your beloved mare while lawyers sort things out." Dr. Henley started to object, but Jed held up a hand to silence him. Something in Cartwright's manner suggested this was all an elaborate bluff, but the railroad man held too many advantages for direct confrontation to be wise. "I need time to think about this," Jed said carefully. "Of course, But don't take too long. We'll be filing the necessary paperwork when we reach the territorial capital tomorrow. After that, the matter will be out of my hands." As the 5 riders disappeared back into the darkness, Dr. Henley turned to Jed with fire in his eyes. "They're trying to steal her, plain and simple. We can't let them get away with this." But Jed was thinking about Samuel's letter, about the promise his son had extracted from Colonel Patterson, and about the larger forces at work in their small drama. The railroad represented progress and civilization, but it also represented the kind of ruthless ambition that saw everything: horses, land, people as commodities to be acquired and exploited. "There has to be a way to fight this," Henley continued. "Colonel Patterson seemed like an honorable man. Maybe he can help." Jed fingered Samuel's letter in his vest pocket, drawing strength from his son's words about love, finding a way to cross any divide. An idea was forming in his mind, born from desperation, but nurtured by hope. "Doc, how long would it take us to reach Dry Creek if we pushed hard?" 12 hours, maybe 14 if the weather holds. But Jed, Clementine's hoof, will have to hold up for one more run, because I think I know how to beat them at their own game." As they broke camp in the pre-dawn darkness, preparing for one final desperate race against time and legal machinations, Clementine seemed to sense the urgency of their situation. Despite her lingering soreness, she moved with renewed purpose, as if understanding that this journey would determine not just her fate, but the future of everything they had built together. The mountain trail stretched ahead in the growing light, winding toward home and a confrontation that would test everything Jed had learned about love, loyalty, and the price of doing what's right. Behind them, the railroad men would be pursuing their legal strategy, confident that money and lawyers could overcome any sentimental attachment between a grieving father and the horse his son had died protecting. But they had underestimated the power of community, the strength that came from people who had watched a broken man find redemption through an act of kindness. In Dry Creek, word would already be spreading about Tommy Henderson's miraculous rescue and the mare who had carried him to safety. By the time Cartwright and his legal papers reached town, they would find not just one stubborn mountain man defending his horse, but an entire community ready to stand behind a story that had reminded them all why some things mattered more than profit. The race was on, and for the first time since this odyssey began, Jed felt like they might actually win. They reached Dry Creek just as the church bells were ringing noon, Clementine's hooves throwing up clouds of dust as they thundered down Main Street. Word of their approach had spread quickly, and it seemed like half the town had gathered to welcome them home. Agnes Henderson was the first to reach them, tears streaming down her face as she ran alongside Clementine. "Tommy's alive!" she called out, her voice breaking with emotion. "Dr. Webb sent word ahead. The surgery was perfect and our boy is going to be fine." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, but Jed barely heard them. His eyes were scanning the street for any sign of railroad agents or legal officials. They had perhaps hours before Cartwright's papers reached the territorial marshal, and everything depended on what happened next. Magnus Cordell pushed through the crowd, his weathered face beaming with pride and something that might have been shame. "Jed, the whole territory's talking about what you and Clementine did. Folks are calling it a miracle. Magnus, I need to talk to everyone, the whole town. Can you ring the meeting bell?" The store owner looked puzzled, but nodded. Within minutes, the bronze bell that called the community together for important decisions was clanging across the valley. People began converging on the small square in front of the general store, their faces filled with curiosity and celebration. As the crowd gathered, Jed remained mounted on Clementine, her copper coat gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. She stood proudly despite her exhaustion, as if sensing that this moment would define both their futures. "Folks," Jed began, his voice carrying across the square, "you all know what Clementine and I did these past few days. We saved Tommy Henderson's life, and we proved that sometimes the things others call worthless are actually the most precious of all." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Pete Morrison, who had mocked Jed's trade just weeks before, called out, "That horse is worth her weight in gold, Jed." "That's the problem," Jed replied grimly. "The railroad thinks so too." He told them about Cartwright's visit, about the legal challenge, and the threat to take Clementine away. As he spoke, he could see anger building in the faces around him. Not the casual irritation of inconvenience, but the deep fury that came when outsiders threatened one of their own. "They can't do that," shouted Ben Crawford, the banker who had once questioned Jed's competence. "You saved that boy's life." "Legal papers say they can," Jed replied. "Unless we can prove that Clementine belongs here, with people who understand her true value." Dr. Henley had dismounted and was moving through the crowd, explaining the details of the railroad's claim to anyone who would listen. The physician's medical authority gave weight to his words, and Jed could see the community's mood shifting from celebration to determination. It was then that an unexpected voice cut through the discussion. "Maybe I can help with that." The crowd parted to reveal an elderly woman leaning heavily on a walking stick. Mary Whitman was 93 years old and the unofficial historian of Dry Creek, a keeper of stories and memories that stretched back to the territory's earliest days. "Mrs. Whitman," Jed said, dismounting to approach her respectfully. "What do you mean?" The old woman's eyes were sharp, despite her age, and she studied Clementine with the gaze of someone who had seen many horses in her long life. "I mean, I knew your boy Samuel, Jed. Knew him before he went off to war." A hush fell over the crowd. Samuel's story was known to everyone in Dry Creek, but Mary Whitman rarely spoke of the past unless she had something important to share. "Samuel came to see me the night before he left for the army," she continued, her voice carrying clearly despite its frailness. "Brought me something to keep safe. Said it was important and that someday someone might need it to prove a truth that others would try to hide." She reached into her shawl and withdrew a small wooden box, worn smooth by decades of careful handling. "He made me promise to give this to whoever brought home the horse he was going to save. Said I'd know when the time was right." With trembling hands, she opened the box to reveal a brass medallion on a leather cord, a cavalry unit insignia that Jed recognized from Samuel's few letters home. But wrapped around the medallion was something else, an official document bearing military seals and signatures. "A presidential commission," Dr. Henley read over Jed's shoulder, his voice filled with awe. "Signed by Abraham Lincoln himself, authorizing Samuel Boone to protect and relocate Virginia mountain horses as a matter of national security." The implications were staggering. If Samuel had been operating under presidential authority, then any horses he protected would be considered government property held in trust. The railroad's civilian ownership claims would be meaningless against federal documentation, but it was what Jed found at the bottom of the box that brought tears to his eyes. Small note in Samuel's careful handwriting. "For Pa, when you find her, you'll know why God let me go. Love never dies, it just changes form. S." The crowd had gone completely silent, understanding that they were witnessing something far more significant than a dispute over horse ownership. This was about love transcending death, about promises kept across impossible odds, and about the power of community to protect what truly mattered. Mary Whitman looked up at Jed with eyes that held 9 decades of wisdom. "Your boy knew, Jed. Somehow, he knew that love would find a way to bring her home." The confrontation came 3 hours later, just as the afternoon shadows were lengthening across Main Street. 5 riders approached from the east, Cartwright and his hired guns, along with a 6th man wearing the badge of a territorial marshal. They rode with the confident swagger of men who believed the law was on their side. But they pulled up short when they saw what awaited them in the town square. The entire population of Dry Creek had assembled, forming a protective semicircle around Jed and Clementine. Men stood with their rifles visible but not threatening, while women and children filled the spaces between them. It was a display of quiet determination that spoke louder than any shouted defiance. Marshal David Porter dismounted and approached with the careful movements of a man who understood crowd dynamics. He was older than Cartwright's hired men, with the weathered look of someone who had spent years keeping peace in difficult places. "Mr. Boone," he said formally, "I have a warrant here for the seizure of one horse, described as a chestnut mare approximately 14 hands high, in connection with a disputed ownership claim filed by the Central Pacific Railroad Company." "Marshal Porter," Jed replied respectfully, "before you execute that warrant, I'd like you to examine some evidence that might change the legal situation." He held up Samuel's commission and the accompanying documentation, explaining their significance while the crowd listened in tense silence. As he spoke, Jed could see understanding dawn in the marshal's experienced eyes. "A presidential commission," Porter murmured, studying the papers carefully. "I've seen a few of these in my time. They carry considerable legal weight, even 20 years later." Cartwright pushed forward, his face flushed with anger. "Marshal, this is clearly a fabrication. Those papers could have been forged by anyone with access to military stationery." "Could have been," Porter agreed. "Except for one thing." He pointed to a specific section of the commission where Lincoln's signature was accompanied by a unique seal. "This is a wartime presidential seal, Mr. Cartwright. There are maybe a dozen documents in existence with this particular marking, and they're all accounted for in federal archives. This one authorizes Samuel Boone to act as a special agent for the preservation of strategic horse bloodlines." Dr. Henley stepped forward with additional evidence. "Marshal, I was present when Colonel James Patterson identified this mare as Carolina's Storm, a direct descendant of horses protected under that commission. He can verify both the horse's identity and the legitimacy of federal interest in her bloodline." "Patterson?" Porter's eyebrows rose. "Colonel Patterson is the territorial military liaison. His word carries considerable weight in matters like this." Cartwright was growing increasingly desperate. "This is all very interesting from a historical perspective, but it doesn't change the basic facts. The railroad purchased this horse through legitimate channels, and we have bills of sale to prove it." "Bills of sale from dealers who stole her from federal protection," Jed said quietly. "Samuel died trying to keep horses like Clementine out of the hands of men who would exploit them. The federal government never relinquished its interest in the surviving bloodlines." Mary Whitman chose that moment to speak up, her voice carrying across the square with surprising strength. "Marshal Porter, I've lived in this territory for 70 years, and I've never seen a more clear-cut case of federal protection superseding civilian claims." The old woman's reputation for honesty was legendary, and her words carried weight that legal documents alone might not have possessed. Porter nodded slowly, his decision crystallizing. "Mr. Cartwright, I'm going to have to suspend execution of this warrant pending federal review. If the horse is indeed protected under presidential authority, then civilian ownership claims are null and void." "This is outrageous," Cartwright exploded. "The railroad has invested considerable resources in acquiring these animals." "Then you should have checked federal records before making those investments," Porter replied calmly. "Mr. Boone, you'll need to file the proper paperwork with the territorial office within 30 days. But for now, the mare remains in your custody." As the marshal and his party prepared to leave, Cartwright made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "This isn't over, Boone. The railroad has ways of dealing with obstacles to progress." The threat hung in the air like smoke, but before Jed could respond, Pete Morrison stepped forward. The man who had once mocked his horse trade now placed himself squarely between Cartwright and Clementine. "Mister," Pete said, his voice deadly quiet, "that horse saved Tommy Henderson's life. She's a hero in this town, and anyone who threatens her will have to answer to all of us." One by one, the other townspeople moved forward, forming a protective barrier around Jed and Clementine. Magnus Cordell stood beside Pete, followed by Ben Crawford, Dr. Henley, and dozens of others who had witnessed the transformation of both man and horse. Cartwright looked around at the determined faces surrounding him and realized that his legal maneuvering had only strengthened the community's resolve. Sometimes the law was about more than paperwork and ownership claims. Sometimes it was about justice and the recognition that certain bonds transcended mere property rights. As the railroad men rode away empty-handed, the crowd began to disperse, but not before each person had taken a moment to touch Clementine's neck or whisper words of gratitude for what she had done. Standing in the gathering dusk, with his hand on his beloved mare's neck, Jedediah Boone finally understood what Samuel had known all along, that love truly never dies. It just changes form, flowing from father to son to horse and back again in an endless circle of grace. Spring came early to Dry Creek that year, arriving with the kind of gentle warmth that seemed to promise healing for old wounds and new beginnings for weathered hearts. Jed stood in the doorway of his barn, watching Clementine graze in the meadow behind his cabin, her copper coat gleaming in the morning sunlight. 6 months had passed since their desperate journey to save Tommy Henderson, and the story had grown with each telling until it had become part of the territory's folklore. Travelers still stopped in Dry Creek, hoping to catch a glimpse of the miracle horse who had carried a dying boy through impossible mountain passes, guided by love that transcended death itself. But for Jed, the real miracle wasn't in the dramatic rescue or the legal victory over the railroad. It was in the quiet moments like this one, when he could simply stand and watch Clementine move with the fluid grace of perfect health. Knowing that she was home where she belonged, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew his attention to the trail that wound down from the main road. A single rider was approaching, Colonel Patterson, judging by the military bearing and the quality of his mount. Jed hadn't seen the man since that night in the territorial capital, when the truth about Samuel's sacrifice had finally been revealed. "Mr. Boone," Patterson called as he dismounted. "I hope you don't mind an unexpected visitor. Colonel, you're always welcome here. Coffee's fresh if you're interested." They sat on the porch overlooking the meadow, sharing coffee and comfortable silence while Clementine continued her grazing. Patterson seemed different somehow, less burdened than he had been during their first meeting, as if some long-carried weight had finally been lifted from his shoulders. "I wanted to thank you," Patterson said eventually, "for keeping the promise Samuel extracted from me, even though you didn't know you were doing it." Jed fingered his son's letter in his vest pocket, a habit that had become as natural as breathing. "I think Samuel knew exactly what he was doing. Question is, how did he know I'd be the one to find her? Faith, perhaps, or maybe just a father's understanding of another father's heart." Patterson paused, studying Clementine with obvious admiration. "You know, the federal government has officially recognized her bloodline as a protected heritage breed. There are only 12 Virginia mountain horses left in the world, and she's the last fertile mare of direct Thunder Mountain King lineage." The implications of that statement settled over Jed like a warm blanket. "You're saying she's irreplaceable. More than that, I'm saying she's the future of her entire breed." Patterson reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a document bearing official seals. "This is a federal breeding commission, Mr. Boone. It designates your property as a protected sanctuary and provides an annual stipend for maintaining the bloodline." Jed stared at the paper in amazement. The government was essentially paying him to love and care for Clementine, ensuring that her exceptional qualities would be passed on to future generations. "There's more," Patterson continued. "The Territorial Hospital has established the Samuel Boone Memorial Fund, dedicated to emergency medical transport in remote areas. Dr. Henley spoke at the dedication ceremony, telling Tommy Henderson's story and explaining how one horse's courage saved a boy's life. Tears gathered in Jed's eyes as he realized the full scope of his son's legacy. Samuel had died protecting horses like Clementine, and now she would ensure that other children would have the chance to live and grow and make their own contributions to the world. "Thank you for telling me," Jed said quietly. Patterson stood to leave, but paused at the edge of the porch. "One more thing, Mr. Boone. The railroad has abandoned its plans to acquire Virginia mountain horses. Seems they've decided there are easier ways to build their mountain routes." As the colonel rode away, Jed remained on the porch, watching Clementine and thinking about the strange paths that love could take. He had traded away his winter supplies for what everyone called a worthless horse, driven by grief and a loneliness that seemed impossible to heal. But Samuel had known better. Somehow, across the vast divide of death, his son had understood that salvation would come not through forgetting the past, but through embracing the possibility of new love, new purpose, new meaning in a life that had seemed empty beyond repair. The sound of children's laughter drew his attention to the road, where Tommy Henderson was walking hand in hand with his younger sister. The boy moved with only the slightest limp now, a reminder of his ordeal, but also proof of his complete recovery. "Mr. Boone," Tommy called, breaking free from his sister's grasp to run toward the fence where Clementine was grazing. "Can I give her some apples? Ma said I could if you didn't mind." "Course you can, son. She's always happy to see you." Jed watched as Tommy carefully fed Clementine apple slices through the fence rails, chattering excitedly about school and his friends and his plans for the future. The mare listened with patient attention, occasionally nickering in response, as if she understood every word. In that simple scene, Jed found the truth that had eluded him for so long. Wealth wasn't measured in gold coins or land holdings or comfortable circumstances. True riches came from moments like this, watching a child who was alive because of love and sacrifice, seeing a horse who had found her purpose in service to others, understanding that some bonds were stronger than death itself. As the sun set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of copper that matched Clementine's coat, Jedediah Boone felt the last of his grief transform into something else. Gratitude for the journey that had brought him to this moment, this place, this understanding that love truly never dies, it just changes form, flowing from father to son to horse and back again, creating connections that no force on earth could break. In the gathering dusk, surrounded by the quiet contentment of home, that seemed like miracle enough for any man. The worthless horse had indeed made him rich beyond belief, not in gold or silver, but in the kind of wealth that mattered most, a heart finally at peace with itself and a future filled with purpose and hope.